There is a political people who say that the way to get votes is identify some particular group and by some characteristic that's obvious, their race, their culture, their language, or whatever. Promise them certain entitlements or rights or something. Then tell them that the only way you're going to get this is you got to vote for us. If you vote for the other guys, they're going to take it away from you. And then you insulate this policy from, if anybody criticizes this, you're prejudiced against that particular group. This is at the heart, the cynical heart of identity politics. And say, to be frank, it's practiced in this country most by the federal Liberals. But I argue in the end, it's extremely divisive. It makes necessary I have to say, what gender are you, or what racial group are you, or what's your sexual orientation, or what's your religious orientation, because I'm going to offer you some rights if you vote for me, and if anybody criticizes this, by golly, they're prejudiced against you on that. Well, in the end, I think it's extremely divisive. I don't know how you keep a country, a population. The other approach is to say, what do we share in common? We're all human beings entitled to respect regardless of your gender, your race, your culture, your language, your sexual orientation. Those are two fundamentally different ways of looking at the population. Yeah. And I would argue that unity politics, it's built on what we share in common as distinct to what divides us or what the differences are. The one approach is far more conducive to unity, community unity, even national unity than the other.
Hello, Preston.
Oh, hello.
I'm so delighted to be talking to you about your book, Do Something, because I want to start by telling you how I think a lot of conservatives are feeling right now. I think we're demoralized. I think we feel like we've lost.
Yeah.
And after reading your book, I think, why would anyone want to be anything other than conservative? And I've got to get out there and I've got to build this movement. And I hope that that's how people feel at the end of our conversation as
and
well.
There's a lot can be done. Yeah, there's a lot that can be done. And that was the whole theme of the thing, do something.
So tell me why, if you accept that conservatives are feeling demoralized, what do you think some of the reasons for that are?
Well, I think some of the electoral defeats and not being successful at the polls, particularly, although at the provincial level, Conservatives have done quite well. I think the assault on a lot of Conservative ideals, the freedom of speech, freedom of economic activity, the prevailing view that some action by government is the answer to every conceivable problem. I think all of these things pile up, and I do worry too about the younger generation, particularly the social media facilitate this talking about it, blogging about it, tweeting about it, is almost substituting discussion for actually doing something is hurting Conservatives, is hurting the political process generally. That's why I entitled the book, Do Something. Don't just talk about it, do something.
And I should say you've got an action a day, 365 actions. We will put a number of those up. One of the things that it strikes me about conservative politicians, and this is what I like about how you've approached this, you ground it in first principles, but it seems to me a lot of conservative politicians think that once they get elected, they just need to do exactly what the other guys do on the other side, but just do it more efficiently. There doesn't seem to be a grounding in principles anymore around conservatism.
And I think there's a particular problem for provincial governments. Like the three big areas of provincial jurisdiction are health, education, and social services, which Conservatives feel less comfortable about in those areas. They wish it was all about the economy. And so what do you do if you're running a government with 2/3 of its budget spent on health, education, and social service? The tendency is, well, let's just do what the other guys were doing. We'll manage the welfare state better than the other people. And I don't think that's adequate. I think there is a Conservative approach to delivery of social services that's fundamentally different. But that's what I try to get into. The other point I try to make is I've got a lot to say to Conservatives, but I've got a lot to say to small d Democrats. Mm-hmm. And this goes beyond the left, right, center spectrum to whether you're left, right, or center. In this country, you ought to be a small d Democrat. And there's a lot that needs to be done to strengthen and revitalize democracy, regardless of where you are, left, right, center, within that system.
Do you think the term, I used to think this before I read the book, I used to think that the term conservatism was dead, that there's something wrong with it. that because it sort of harkens back to the traditional values, and I think in terms of how often conservatives get pegged, it's like we want to return to the 1950s. And so it creates this barrier to people wanting to enter into the conservative movement. But I think you've done some great work in helping me kind of rethink conservatism along a broader time scale. Yeah, and I want you to see if you can tell us the story of Dr. Anna Rudovich.
Yeah, well, that goes back to the first time I ran for Parliament was in the 60s, and I just ran to get the experience. I had no chance of winning. I ran in this riding, Edmonton East, which was one of the most multicultural ridings in the country at that time, certainly in Alberta. And I had a friend, a business friend, August Osis was his name. He was a Latvian. In that riding, there was a lot of division between the people with German background and Russian background, depending on who done what to whom in 300 years back, whereas the Latvians usually got trampled over by the other guys, so they could hold a meeting where everybody would come, whereas if somebody else held it, they wouldn't come. Anyway, this August Osis invited me to a meeting that was to celebrate the brief period when Latvia got independence between the wars. And the guest speaker, and I have heard hundreds and hundreds of political speeches, so the fact that I remember this one, tells me it was something special. And this Dr. Rudovich gave this speech on the three great commandments of Western civilization. And she said this was applicable particularly to people in the political process. And the first one was know thyself, from Socrates and the Greeks. And she expanded on that. If you're going to get in the political arena, you better know the history of your country. You better know the history of your system, the history of your party, your own personal history, the history of the people that you're dealing with. Know yourselves, know yourself. And then the second one was control yourselves. And that goes back to Moses and the Hebrew law and Roman law, the rule of law. Control yourself, respect for the rule of law, and its application to yourself, self-control, not just controlling others through the rule of law. She elaborated on that. And then the third one was from Jesus of Nazareth, serve. Give yourself. Self-sacrificial service was the ultimate kind of service. And if you get in the political business, remember you're there to serve, not to rule. And it was very profound talks. And I think for anybody getting into the political arena, no matter what your partisan affiliation is, know yourselves, control yourself, and give yourself is a pretty good set of principles to go by.
Do you know why I love that story is because I think we talk about the Judeo-Christian tradition as being the foundation of Western civilization. Yeah. But that story expands it out to be the Socratic Judeo-Christian tradition. And I think that's a lot more embracing of those who might not have sort of traditional religious ties, but still very much value the intellectual tradition.
And you can come at those concepts you don't have to come at them from a religious standpoint either. Know yourself, control yourself, the rule of law. If you don't want to root it in Moses' 10 Commandments, then you can root it in Roman law, which actually does inform a lot of English common law, and self-sacrificial giving has been taught by others. But it was a very profound talk, and I remember it to this day. This must have been, 60, 70 years ago?
Well, do you know what? The other part, too, is that I think in terms of how conservatives are portrayed in the popular media and the social media by political opponents, they're almost seen to, I think this maybe it's Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale that has created this image of that's what conservatives, if conservatives had their druthers, this is the kind of world that they would want to create. But if you look at the 2,500 years of intellectual history, that's a tradition that is worth conserving.
Oh, yes. And I think where conservatives are misrepresented, the challenge is to present the proper conceptualization and not just to accept it. And that's what I try to do in a number of ways in this book. And that's a principle, I think, in political warfare. If you find yourself fighting on ground that's been defined by your opponents, you don't keep struggling within that framework. You try to change the framework. And I think that's something that conservatives have to do on a number of fronts, on the environmental front, on the social services front. Don't struggle with it. Try to win the battle within a framework that has been defined by your opponents. Change the framework, challenge the framework, change the framework.
Well, I love that story because I think it sets the groundwork for us to change the framework through this whole discussion.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about this. You get into this quite a bit about, we often refer to the left and the right. I'm trying not to use that language. It's so natural to use it. Yeah. Coming from a media background, you often refer to a right-wing party or a left-wing party. And one of the things that always frustrated me about learning about that spectrum is that it's such an old spectrum. It's kind of a World War II.
I used to raise the question, like that comes from the seating arrangements after the French Revolution, when the conservatives and the nobles sat on the right, and the peasants and the labor element sat on the left. Like, why are we using a framework that came out of the French Revolution as a way of defining our politics? And where I got into challenging this was we had this Manning Center for Building Democracy, where we're trying to particularly provide services to younger people to get them more engaged in the political process. And in interviewing younger people and asking, where do you put yourself on the left, right, center spectrum? A lot of them say, well, I don't like that framework. I don't think of myself in that context. So we started to put on these, we call them political engagement sessions. We invited a bunch of mainly younger people to our center. And then when they came in, we had posters on the wall showing alternative axes. Here's a democratic, this isn't the left, right, center one, this is a democratic axis. Do you like decision-making involving large numbers of people and referendum and elections and stuff like that? Or do you prefer more expert, kind of top-down decision-making? Where would you put yourself? We used to give them a sticker and say, stick yourself on this axis. And we had about 15 of these axes. We had an environmental one. Do you think the best approach to environment is through government regulation and government intervention, or do you think there's a place for entrepreneurship and market mechanism? Where would you put yourself on that one? We had about 15 of these. And what we found was that these younger people were much more comfortable about placing themselves on those axes than they were on the left, right, center framework. And this is another illustration of changing the conceptual framework so it means something to the people you're talking about.
Completely. I must say, so the left-right spectrum, I'm glad you sort of rooted it in the French Revolution. To me, I was taught that on the extreme left is communism, on the extreme right is fascism. Yeah. And as someone who loves liberty, I thought, I don't want either of those. I don't want either an authoritarian left or an authoritarian right.
And they tend to bend around, and what they have in common is authoritarianism. So it's
completely. So what is the proper language for us to be using then when we talk about, because there is a difference in ideology. Those who are advancing the identity politics, who want more government spending, who are increasingly less interested in free speech, we have to call them something. And those of us who want other things, we have to call us something. So what terms do you use? If you don't use left and right, what terms do you use to identify that there's this difference?
Well, I tend to use those different axes depending on what the person's... I'm what's called a receiver-oriented communicator. And I make a big distinction between receiver-oriented communicators and source-oriented communicators. Source-oriented communicators wants to say what, like if I'm source-oriented, I want to say what I want to say in the language that I want to say it. And so there's a place for source-oriented communication, particularly, say, among scientists who are talking to peers that share the framework. A receiver-oriented communicator, and this is what a small d Democrat should be, doesn't start with what do I want to say. It starts with who are these people I'm talking to? What is their frame of reference? What is their vocabulary? How would they say what I want to say to them if they were saying it to somebody else? And so I think you get your clues as to what language to use, what framework to use, in part by asking the person that you're talking to what framework they're operating in, and start there. Eventually you get around to saying what you want to say, but you do it in the language and within the framework that they want to say it.
You know what you're striking me with, and we will talk about that chart because I want to put that up so that you can explain it. So we'll talk in terms of your language, is that I think in the media and also in politics, we tend to attach labels. So conservative means something in the big P politics world. Liberal means something. New Democrat means something. But it's not really necessarily that easy to pin that down on any of these different axes that you're talking about.
You can get these frameworks. This isn't quite addressing what you're talking about, but it does illustrate this difference between source-oriented and receiver-oriented communication. During the Charlottetown Accord debate. I had an hour-long speech on all the previous attempts to get national unity through constitutional change. And it was dull, it was accurate, it was dull and dry. I went through every conceivable attempt to achieve national unity by changing the Constitution. And my conclusion was you don't get unity by doing that. But it was dull and boring with public audiences. You just could tell you're putting them to sleep. So, but I used to always hang around after my meetings and listen to, and not just for the sake of glad handing, listen hard to what people were saying. And eventually somebody will kind of try to say what you were saying to them, but the way they would explain it to their friends. And this one guy says to me, he says, this national unity, he says, we're like kids in the back of the car, and the prime minister or somebody's driving the car. We're just saying, are we there yet? Are we there yet? And so I reframed the whole time. I said, Pierre Trudeau said national unity was over in on the national constitutional drive, and he's driving the car fast, and he's giving guys the finger out the window, and René Lévesque's in the back saying he's going to be sick if we don't let him out, and we never got to that place, and then we let Joe drive the car, but Joe forgot to put gas in it, so it didn't last very long. Now Brian says it's over near some lake or Meech Lake or someplace, and I carried the whole thing. I could say what I wanted to say, but I carried it on an analogy that was suggested by a guy trying to say to me, that's what I think you're saying. And I think the more our communication is, whether conservatives or Democrats or a politician of any kind, is framed in the conceptual framework of the people we're talking to and the language we're talking to, you don't abandon what you want to say, but you ended up, that's a more effective way of doing it than say, look, this is my ideology and this is my policy, and I'm going to tell you it. I'm going to tell you it exactly the way I like to say it. You lose people by doing that.
Okay, so as a boomer, you're going to teach me as a Gen Xer how to talk to millennials and Zeds. And so I want to pull up the graph, if we could, that looks at these different axes that you're talking about. And you said there's about, let me count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 axes.
Yeah.
So one of the speeches that you gave when I was at one of the Reform Party conventions years ago that was so influential on me in redefining what politics was, is you talked about, I think, 3-dimensional politics, where there was an axis for the social issues, there was an axis for the economic issues, then there was a democratic axis, and then after that you brought in the environmental axis as well. So it seems to me like you've really broadened this out. So let's go through each of these, and you can give us an idea of what the spectrum looks like. And I must tell you how I'm probably going to hear it is, if you're on this side of the spectrum, you're probably a conservative. If you're on that side of the spectrum, you're probably a progressive. So we'll see whether I'm right on this. So let's talk about the democratic axis. When you're talking to the kids about where they fall on this axis, how do you put it to them so that they know where to put their dot?
Well, because I'm not trying to tell them to put their dot. I say, where do you put your dot? And I say the two poles there are this bottom-up decision-making where you really do consult the people themselves and give them a chance to say what they want to say. The other approach is that where government policy is more dictated by expert opinion and by what the executive and what the people that have power think it should be. Where do you put yourself? And people who put themselves in different categories. Some people will say, well, I have great respect for expert opinion, and I would defer to expert opinion, and I worry about these uneducated rabble at this end, so I don't trust them. So people will put themselves one place or the other. On that particular axis, one of my favorite quotes from Jefferson, who, if anybody had the right to be considered a political elite, he did. But in 1820, he wrote to somebody, and in 1820, Andrew Jackson, who was the Trump of his day, was starting to show up on the American political scene. And you can imagine someone like Jefferson, what he thought of a guy like Jackson, who was not from New England and was a wild man in many respects. But Jefferson wrote, I can think of no safer depository for the ultimate powers of society than in the people themselves. Mm-hmm. And then anticipating the blowback, but the people themselves, they're not educated, they don't know beans. And he said, and if you think them not fit to exercise self-government with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion. Mm-hmm. Now that's a very, if you think the public isn't qualified to make this decision or to have a judgment on them, rather than say, well, take it out of their hands and give it to the experts. He says, consult expert opinion, but use it to inform the discretion of the rank and file.
Yes, the
and that's a pretty good commentary on that axis. And he ended up on the side of the people, but with that qualification.
Yes, it's the job of the politician to convince.
To inform their discretion.
Okay, so I'm going to put my mark. I think that people don't want to be consulted about every little thing, but they do want to be consulted about the big things. So I put myself probably more on the decentralized authority side of the spectrum. So the next spectrum part, the next axis you talk about, government regulated markets versus individuals, entrepreneurs, and free markets. So how do you see that axis? Where do you find that most people, or the differentiation on people on that axis?
I myself tend to push back against this idea that the government is the answer to everything, including what's going on in the economy. That the more freedom that you leave to people to invest, to make decisions, to found businesses, to organize business, to run businesses, the better. And I worry about people that actually feel that some action by government is the answer to every conceivable problem, particularly ones in the economy. I think you end up with a government-dominated economy. We can get into this later, but I think that's the big ideological contest in the 21st century, is going to be between the Chinese model of state-directed capitalism, and they call it capitalism, versus market-driven capitalism, state-directed democracy, and they use the word democracy, versus citizen-directed democracy. And I think we ought to be on the side of citizen-directed democracy and market-driven capitalism, but we're going to have to pull up our socks in order to compete with that
completely
model.
We will talk a lot more about that, because I'm really interested in seeing who's going to win, who you think is going to win that discussion. You've got a values axis. So tell us what that means. What are the range of values that are in competition or conflict?
Well, I almost come at that by asking people what their own values are, but that's, you can divide the world there more along conservative and liberal or socialist lines. What value do you place on the individual and on individual freedom of speech, individual freedom of action, versus what value do you put on collective action? And it is not saying there isn't a place for collective action, but I think that the division there is between individualism and collectivism, and trying to find out where people are on that axis. And when we did these receptions, we had these 12 or 15 or however many there were, but at the end we asked them, if you had to pick only 3 of these, what you had to narrow it down to your 3-dimensional space, what would the 3 be? And there was we didn't arrive at any great consensus on this, but the discussion was quite good. And what you got involvement from these young people that said, if you're going to talk about politics in terms of left, right, center, well, count me out.
Completely.
They would engage on these axes and argue which one ought to be the most important.
Then we've definitely got to go through a few more of them, because I think for us in the conservative movement, we have to figure out how to talk to millennials and Zeds in their own language so that they don't look at this as being kind of exclusionary. I think there's a lot of millennials and Zeds, and I don't know if it's that the Greens and the NDs and the Liberals have a better way of communicating to them, but we have to understand how these different issues resonate
and have a
with
rebuttal
them.
to these people. Say, well, I don't like the way politics is, so I'm not going to engage. And I used to cite to public audiences, and particularly to younger people, what I call the iron law of democratic politics is, if you decide to not involve yourself in the politics of your country, you will be governed by those who do. There are people who will get involved. And if you don't like them generationally or for whatever reason, you're going to be governed by them if you don't get involved. And that used to be my fallback position. Don't tell me you're just going to opt out of the system. You're going to be governed by maybe the very opposite of what you want.
Completely, because someone decides. You've also got this axis on health, which is interesting, characterized either by a mixed public-private system or primarily a public taxpayer system. I wonder if this is uniquely Canadian, that part of our politics is centered around how we look at healthcare and the provision of it.
Well, like I'm opposed to monopolies, whether they're public or private. And I think one of the worries we have on the and the whole welfare state is the state virtually becoming a monopoly or a near monopoly on three of the most important services to people: health, education, and social services. But there's people that think that's what ought to be. Okay, they're at this end. The alternative is a mixed public and private system with the freedom of choice for the consumer of health, education, and social systems. And I think eventually we're going to have to get to that. In the health field, you've now got provinces like Quebec, where the health budget now consumes over 50% of the provincial budget. This is unsustainable. And I think this COVID-19 extra demand on the healthcare system is going to prove that that cannot be sustained. So what's the alternative? The alternative is a mixed public and private system with freedom of access and shorter waiting lines for healthcare. And there's other models of this. Canada is the one that's stuck back in this basically a public sector dominated system. The socialists in Canada used to always point to the Scandinavian countries because they had the first kind of Medicare system. All of them have moved to a more mixed system, been forced to do it by the finances of it, and I think we will eventually too. But that's something I think Conservatives should champion.
You've got two others on here that I think are of the same character: education and poverty. It's interesting to me that you have them in there, but I guess it's the same challenge. And they kind of have to be in there because, as we started off talking about, that is not the vast majority of what provincial governments spend their money on is these
and
three things.
Conservatives have to, I think, develop some alternative mechanisms for dealing with those three areas because there's such an enormous part of a provincial budget.
Okay, we'll talk more about those in the next segment. Talk to me about the lifestyle axis, limited by traditions, religious principles, or cultural norms on the one side, and completely unrestricted except for your own moral code.
Well, and this, I guess, is reflecting the conservative approach is that there's merit in your history and in your historical, where you came from historically, and you should honor and respect it. The opposite end on that is just disregarding everything that went before, and it's just what I believe and what I think today, and that's a good argument to have with younger people. You know, where are you on that spectrum? And I would argue that there's reason for respecting tradition and where you've come from, and not just thinking history began the day you were born and whatever is relevant to you today.
And that, in some ways, is, I think, the area where you end up with the most fierce opposition, people getting really entrenched in their position, one side versus another. That one seems to be the hardest one to reconcile, is bringing those of us who are more libertarian-minded together with those who are more conservative-minded.
Well, and on a lot of these axes, like I suggest that what conservatives ought to be the representative of balance. That there's, you know, and in a public debate, you can, like, there's this bunch at this end and there's this bunch at that end. But what we're trying to do is find the balance. And by balance, I don't mean some meaningless compromise between the extremes, but some balanced position. And I believe that ought to have some inherent appeal to Canadians. Like there's these old jokes about why did the Canadian cross the road to get to the middle? Our national game, hockey, why has it got 3 periods? Basketball and football have 2 halves, and we have 3 periods. Why? Because there's a middle. Canadians want a middle. Why do Canadians live in Winnipeg? Because they don't want to be out on the edge. You know, there's all these stories, but that does say something about the Canadian character. Canadians do not want to be out on the edge. They want a balanced position. And if Conservatives could present themselves as the representation of balance, where's the balance in the midst of this COVID-19 business between health protection, the protection of your rights and freedoms under the Charter? Not all health protection and untrammeled freedom, but where's the balance? I think if Conservatives could present themselves as the advocates of balance, it would be you could position yourself adequately on almost all of these spectrums.
I love that word, because the word that liberals, progressives, whatever you want to call them, use is I'm a centrist. It's not really being in the center. It's recognizing that there are two different opposing views, and how do you bring them together? I think balance is the perfect word.
Yeah, balance is a great word.
It really is. Okay, let's go through these last few so people understand the complexity of how we have to communicate the message on these various fronts. The other one is a responsibility axis. The government, taxpayers on one side, versus those individuals and their family. How do you frame that when you're talking to the millennial generation?
Which one is that again? Sorry.
It's the responsibility axis.
Okay, yeah, well, I guess that gets into, to what extent you assume responsibility for yourself and your family and your own well-being, and to what extent you lean on the state for it. And again, with younger people, I'd let them discuss that, but the caution I'd have that if you end up becoming dependent on the state, or even in one area, say, well, let the state take care of me there. Eventually the state is willing to take care of more than just what you're willing to let them have. And the danger on that axis is once you surrender your responsibility for yourself and for your own well-being, and you teach your children that, it's very hard to get it back.
That will be our whole conversation about COVID, won't it? I mean,
yes. So this surrendering your own freedom, but your own responsibility for your own well-being, you surrender that too far, and you decide we made a mistake. Let's go back the other way. Very hard to go back.
It can be very difficult. Yeah. You've got three more. You've got the trust axis. There's a big problem of trust, I think, in all of our institutions right now. But on this axis, you talk about, do you have trust in yourself, small business, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, or government corporations, unions? How do you see that spectrum for? Well,
it fits in a bit with this acceptance of responsibility.
Right.
I think there's a general growing mistrust of big organizations, big corporate organizations, big governments, and everything else. But then what's the alternative to that? The alternative to that is for you and the smaller units to accept more responsibility for your own well-being. You know, if you mistrust the big things, then you've got to accept more responsibility at the smaller, the community unit, the individual unit, and again, to force people to try to think that through. You know, you trust government to be the answer to everything. Eventually you'll find that that's not going to work, but you're going to have it very difficult to get that responsibility or that freedom back to a smaller unit.
This next unit that you talk about is really interesting to me, jurisdiction access, because we've spent a lot of time talking about global institutions, international cooperation. Yeah. But isn't it interesting when a crisis hits, your local community, your local decision-making, your national government really become the more important decision-making
and
unit.
Even I used to disagree with it. You know, in law, in Canada, the municipal government is defined, or is talked about at least, as being the third level of government. Partly because the municipalities are a creation of mainly of the provincial governments. Although I used to point out in the BNA Act, there's an appendix to the BNA Act that nobody ever reads, but it defines the original constituencies of the federal union, and it defines the constituencies in terms of local municipal areas. So who's the child and who's the parent? And I argue that municipal government is the level of government that's closest to the public, and that it ought to be regarded from a democratic standpoint as the first level of government. And that a lot more, and this is an area that Conservatives have neglected. They've tended to neglect the municipal area, and I think that's an area where Conservatives ought to spend a lot more time and energy. That their local government is extremely important. It is the one closest to the public, and if you don't like the big governments or the global governments, well, one of the things to do is to strengthen your local government.
This last one, identity access. I don't know when you identified that, but my goodness, it's really been in the last year that identity politics has taken center stage. Has it always been that way? Like you've got on the one side...
I think there's a cynical view, and I think it's realistic. There is a political people who say the way to get votes is identify some particular group, and by some characteristic that's obvious, their race, their culture, their language, or whatever. Promise them certain entitlements or rights or something. Then tell them that the only way you're going to get this is you got to vote for us. If you vote for the other guys, they're going to take it away from you. And then you insulate this policy from, if anybody criticizes this, you're prejudiced against that particular group. This is at the heart, the cynical heart of identity politics. And say, to be frank, it's practiced in this country most by the federal liberals. But I argue in the end, it's extremely divisive. It makes necessary to, I have to say, what gender are you, or what racial group are you, or what's your sexual orientation, or what's your religious orientation, because I'm going to offer you some rights if you vote for me, and if anybody criticizes this, by golly, they're prejudiced against you on that. But in the end, I think it's extremely divisive. I don't know how you keep a country, a population. The other approach is to say, what do we share in common? We're all human beings entitled to respect regardless of your gender, your race, your culture, your language, your sexual orientation. Those are two fundamentally different ways of looking at the population. Yeah. And I would argue that unity politics, it's built on what we share in common as distinct to what divides us or what the differences are. The one approach is far more conducive to unity, community unity, even national unity than the other.
I love the language that you're using too, because I think that there are conservatives feeling like, how do we offer a counter to the mainstream narrative that's out there, and defining it as unity politics? I think that's appealing, just sort of viscerally appealing.
And in this country, like Canada, it's so big and it is so diverse that we have to, more than a lot of other countries, we have to think, a federal politician has to think constantly about national unity. You cannot take the unity of this country for granted. My worst night in Ottawa, and I was member of Parliament for 9 years, was the night of that referendum, the secession referendum from Quebec. People have no idea how close the country came to breaking up, and the violence that would have accompanied it. We had people come to our office, representatives of the indigenous groups in northern Quebec, saying, if this goes the wrong way, we want to be under federal jurisdiction. If this goes the wrong way, we're going to blow up some of those towers that are carrying electricity to New York just to wake the country up. You're just sitting in a nice office in Ottawa, and the guy across the table saying, that's what I'm going to do if this goes the wrong way. This country cannot take its unity for granted. And I think this identity politics lays the foundation for division, dangerous division.
Well, okay, so now I don't know how you would draw this, because three-dimensional politics I understood. I don't know how you draw this on an axis. I don't know if my brain can actually think of all of these axes all at once, but it does show me that there are multiple ways that you can build a coalition and attract people to your movement on any one of these axes, or any three potentially of these axes.
No, I think so, and I think the old left, right, center axis is not very helpful in particularly appealing to next generation people, or in achieving this kind of unity rather than diversity.
Okay, let's talk a bit, if we can, about ethics in government.
Okay, yeah.
Because you've got some wonderful stories in the book, and in this, it's in the first section where you talk about trust and you talk about ethics. And I think you've got, maybe people don't realize just how long your history was in politics. I didn't realize you worked with your dad, the former Premier of Alberta, Ernest Manning, for 18 years. And then you also had your own 9 years in politics as well. But you had an enviable position about being right at the center of the action and watching politicians have to make these balances, make these decisions every single day. So there's a story that I'd love you to tell about your dad, because I think it talks to the kind of character of people getting attracted to public office. And he had a man who saved his life, a doctor who saved his life, and then came back for a political favor. And I want you to tell us how that story went down.
Well, just to set this in context, when I was young, I thought that no one individual could set the ethical tone of a huge organization, a big oil company, a big government. But I gradually came around to the position that the ethical tone of an organization, particularly a big organization, a government, a political party, is set by nobody other than the leadership. The ethics of the organization will never rise higher than the ethical standards of the leaders. So it's very important what the leaders position is. And I had, of course, I was a great fan of my father, so I'm prejudiced on this, but he never told me this story. My mother told me this story. He came from a family. His mother had TB. She was from England. In fact, the doctor sent her out to the prairies because it's drier climate and it was better if you had a predisposition to TB. Anyway, when my father was elected in 1935, he's a young cabinet minister. He's walking down the street in Edmonton, and he met this Dr. Wright, who was a prominent doctor and been a very big supporter of the social credit movement and the party and everything else. And my father started to cough, and Wright says, I don't like the sound of that cough. You better come to my office. So he went to his office, and by gosh, he diagnosed it. He had TB, which in those days was fairly serious. You had to go to a sanatorium. You had to suspend his political activity for some time. So Dr. Wright, in effect, saved his life. Anyway, a few years later, Father's the premier by now, and he has to appoint the head of the Workmen's Compensation Board in Alberta. And Dr. Wright got it in his head that he wanted to be the chairman of the Workmen's Compensation Board. And my father had great respect for Dr. Wright as a medical guy, but he was not an administrator, and he was not the guy for this job. So my father wouldn't appoint him. And of course, Dr. Wright got extremely wrathy about these kids. Look, you wouldn't be sitting behind that desk if it wasn't for me. You owe your life to me, so you owe me this job. And Father said, no, you're not the right guy to be the head of the compensation board. Well, Dr. Wright, who was very angry as a result of this, broke off all connections with the government, with the party, with my father. Years later, he came around to Dr. Wright to acknowledge that maybe that was the best decision. But in trying to do the right thing and making the appointment rather than the expedient things spoke to me about a high ethical standard. And where Alberta was served well, and you would know this from Alberta's history, in North America, the government of the party that was in power when there was an oil boom, in almost all the American states was corrupted. Texas, California, Oklahoma, Alaska, even the federal administration of Warren G. Harding was almost toppled on the Teapot Dome controversy. The officials took bribes from the oil companies in order to get drilling rights. So when Leduc happened in Alberta, the Leduc discovery, the American oil guys came up, and they had two questions. Not all of them, but some of them had two questions. Where is Leduc, and who do you pay? Because they assumed you paid some official or some political guy in order to get drilling rights. Now, fortunately for Alberta, and this illustrates having people with a high ethical standard at the right place, and just a couple of them. One of the people they went to was a man by the name of Hubert Somerville. He ended up becoming a senior deputy minister, but at that time he was a junior clerk. Alberta didn't have an energy department. It had a department of mines and minerals, and petroleum was way down on the list because there hadn't been much. And they went to Somerville and said, do we pay you to get ahead, to get high in the line, get drilling rights? And Somerville was just a professional civil servant. He said, no, you don't. And if you try that again, you're going to get in trouble with me. The other person they went to was Orvis Kennedy, who was the president of the Social Credit League, of the political party. And they went to Kennedy and said, do we pay you? Because usually in the U.S., you went to the political guy if you're going to bribe somebody. And Kennedy, his ethics were rooted in the Christian commitment. He was a staunch, he felt he was accountable to God, not just to the people of Alberta. And Kennedy told him, you do this. If you offer a bribe to me or any of our people, and by our people he meant MLAs, cabinet ministers, or whatever, not only will you not get anywhere, I will make sure that you don't get drilling rights in the province of Alberta ever. And your company. And of course, the oil guy said, well, that's fine. It's going to be cheaper doing business here than Louisiana. You know, they didn't care, just want to know what the rules were. One story about Kennedy, I never verified this, but some of the oil guys used to, a lot of the MLAs used to stay at the Mayfair Hotel on 9th Avenue at Edmonton. And one Christmas, one of the companies had a big basket with the liquor bottles in it put outside the door of every MLA, government MLA, just to wish them well for the season, you see. And apparently Kennedy got wind of this. He went and collected the baskets and dumped them. The McDonald Hotel was where the oil guys tended to stay. He dumped them under the big Christmas tree at the McDonald Hotel just to try to make the point, you don't get favors here by doing that. I mean, these are kind of legendary stories, how exactly accurate they are. But the point it made is just a couple of people in the right positions kept Alberta from getting corruption into that oil and gas sector. Once that gets in there, it's a dickens of a thing to get out. And just a couple of people setting the ethical tone made a huge difference.
It makes an enormous difference. Yeah. And we'll get into that a little bit more in talking about how those who have strong religious faith should engage in politics, because that gives a good example of how ethics can be brought in, and it would have changed the entire course of our history if we'd done it differently. And look at the governments today, they all run into the ditch on one various ethical issue or another.
Well, I'll tell you one story that disturbed me. I was at a meeting not long ago with an Indigenous group that were in favor of pipelines and want to build pipelines on Indigenous lands. And there was a Chinese investment firm there. There was several investment firms. These Indigenous people were looking for investment capital to put into pipelines. And there was a representative of the Chinese consulate in Calgary at this meeting as well. And they had a question period. It wasn't a large group. They had a question period afterwards. So I asked the representative of the Chinese government, what's the connection between this investment company and the Chinese government? And he said, well, they're a Chinese company. They got to obey Chinese laws and everything. He says, they're not as close to our government as SNC-Lavalin is to yours. Now, I'm not often at a loss for words, but I didn't kind of know what to say. He said, don't tell me, he elaborated on this after, don't tell me that your companies are pure as the driven snow and aren't as thick as thieves with your government. They are, and so are ours. And so let's not make a point about it.
Wow. So not only does it have local implications, but international implications.
Yeah. And that becomes an ethical, that's an ethical question.
So let's talk a bit about money, because I think that there are a lot of people who want to engage in the process, who want to advance their ideals based on some of the things we've been talking about. But we've talked about these ethical problems. We now have all kinds of rules about how you're allowed to support candidates and how you're allowed to support political parties. But you talk about a concept of political investment portfolios. And I want to put that up because for those who are now maybe a little bit confused about how do they make a difference, I think we need to know that the conservative movement is not very well funded compared to other movements, and it needs to be, and it should be. So this is another graph that you've got put up, and you have a whole range of ways in which people should be thinking about how they can support the expansion of the movement. And I want to just go through how you conceptualize this.
Well, I distinguish between the political parties and the conservative side, the conservative movement. And I use a pyramid diagram. It says the political party, the Conservative Party, is at the top of that. You got to get elected people to a parliament or a legislature, but there's a whole bunch of infrastructure underneath it. There's the think tanks that generate intellectual capital. There's the advocacy groups that champion particular conservative causes. There's communicators. There's a whole conservative communication sector. There's the financial sector. There's a whole bunch of other components. That's the movement. And the stronger the movement is, the better the parties will perform. And so when you talk about investing your time as a volunteer or your money, that you should look at the entire movement, not just the parties. As you say, the ability to contribute to the parties is quite restrictive. But you can contribute, you can donate to think tanks, you can donate to advocacy campaigns, you can support communications ventures, you can support training. There's a whole bunch of other things you can support that help the conservative cause. And I argue that whether you got $10 to invest or $100,000, everybody should have one of these political investment portfolios, and every year figure out, and particularly with your children, talk about, we're going to invest in the democratic process. Say you're going to invest on the conservative side. Here's what we're going to put into each of these slots. And from a party standpoint, it's actually far better for a lot of this work to be done below the parties so the parties don't have to do it. And even from the parties, they're far better to get small amounts of money from large numbers of people than to get a big amount of money from just a couple of groups. The Reform Party, when it started out, had very little funds. Our average contribution the first few years was about $42 per donation. But there was many people that made that contribution. One of the biggest contributions we got in the early days, one day we did get a check for $10,000. This was such a big deal that we called the directors together to look at the check and say, isn't this a wonderful thing? And then somebody figured out this was given to us by this particular outfit with the intent of influencing our position on a particular point. And so we reluctantly gave it back. And I can remember our executive director at that time leaving the room weeping, carrying this was the biggest check we ever got. But from a party standpoint, you're better to, the more investment is done down that, lower down in that spectrum, the better. And the party contributions, small amounts of money from large numbers of people.
I'm glad you broadened it out, because I think a lot of people think that donating to a political party or a candidate is the only way to have an influence.
There's a
whole range of ways.
No, there's all this other. And if the think tanks generate policy, the party gets the beneficiary of it, but it doesn't have to do a lot of that investing itself.
Oh, right.
Issue campaigns, yeah.
Let me just finish off with maybe where I started in politics. There used to be something called the Political Clubs Office at the University of Calgary.
Oh, yeah.
And what I loved about it is that you'd have the Reform Party there at the time. Ezra Levant was on campus. You'd have the Political Association at the time. Nahat Nenshi was on campus. And the Liberals and the NDs, we'd all sort of get together and we'd hash out ideas. And so the idea of having a place where you could go, a club, where you could talk about intellectual ideas was so appealing to me. But I don't know that I've ever really seen anything like that ever since. And you talk about the revival of the political club. What do you envision if we revive that tradition?
Well, I think I would say if there's a revival, it ought to be among small d Democrats. Even in the federal parliament, while it's all divided up on partisan lines, surely everybody in that parliament has to be a small d Democrat. We wouldn't be there if it wasn't for the democratic system. And there'd be some merit in having some forums where people of different partisan persuasions can get together at least to talk about how can we strengthen democracy, which is beneficial to us all. And when I went to university, there had the model parliament, the University of Alberta. And interesting, back then, I was in physics, so I wasn't part of the political group. I used to, Ray Speaker, became a cabinet minister, member of parliament. Ray used to talk me into being part of the model parliament for 3 days, but I wasn't part of the circle. But the political circle then, Grant Notley was the head of the NDP party. Joe Clark was the head of the Conservatives on campus. Jim Coots, who became the principal secretary to Pierre Elliott Trudeau, was the Liberal leader. These guys were all into it. Ray Speaker was the leader of the those people all knew each other, which was beneficial years and years later when they got into very prominent positions. They knew each other as individuals, and I think that was a beneficial experience.
Completely, and probably leads to less polarization when you can engage with somebody as another human being as opposed to just a political identity.
Yeah.
All right, let's leave it there.